Hello, my name is Karina and I am the author and illustrator of The Boy Who Rescued a Rainbow. And in this video, we're going to be looking at how this book can be used to support children when dealing with grief. I'm going to be talking about why I wrote the book, what's included in the story, and at the end I'll be able to provide you with some additional resources that you can use to support your child. I'm obviously not a psychologist, but I am a teacher and a mum, and when I wrote this story I did do research into the stages of grief and looking at how best to support children with bereavement. So I'm hoping that some of the research that I did will also be able to help you. So let's start by looking at why I wrote the story in the first place. The Boy Who Rescued a Rainbow was actually written during the pandemic in 2020. And at that time, and as a parent, I was glued to the television, to the news, to what was going on in the world. And there was obviously a lot of talk about death. There was a lot of people losing loved ones or family members. I wanted to write a story that any child could read without necessarily directly linking it to death or to grief. And they could still enjoy the story, but it could prompt some discussion or some valid conversations around the subject. When I was researching how to support children with grief, one of the main points that came across was the importance about talking about feelings and emotions that they might be having in relation to the loss that they have suffered. So I knew that the story was going to have to touch on emotions and feelings and times that we feel sad. And it was from that point that I decided that I really wanted the main character of the story to be a boy, because there'd obviously been a lot of discussion around the importance of encouraging boys when they're young to recognise and accept the emotions and feelings that they have, and to emphasise that everybody cries and everyone feels sad, and that's absolutely fine. So there are two main messages from this story. The first of those is going through the process of grief and grieving, and the second of those is encouraging and supporting boys in particular in dealing with those difficult emotions. Let's talk a little bit about the story and what you'll find in the book. When I wrote the story, I wanted to challenge some of the typical boy stereotypes that are out there. So I decided to start and end the story with thinking about what does it actually mean to be strong and brave and fearless, because those are all words that I felt are quite often associated to boys, but the interpretation of what those words meant to them could vary. So we start the story with the boy and we look and explore at the stereotypical ways in which boys are often thought of as being strong, brave and fearless. So for example, I felt that they would be sailing the deepest oceans, they would be climbing the highest mountains, and of course they would be fighting the deadliest dragons. And it's at this point that the little boy discovers the broken rainbow. The rainbow for me acts as a character within its own right in the story, and I chose the symbol of the rainbow partly because of the pandemic, but also a rainbow symbolises hope. And it's often that reminder that when we come through a storm or when we come through a challenging time, there can be a rainbow at the end. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. So I love the idea of being able to find this rainbow. It's broken, it becomes a character in its own right, and the boy decides to take the rainbow home and nurture it and bring it back to life. One of my favourite parts of this story is following the journey of the boy figuring out how he can fix this rainbow and nurture it and care for it. Because quite often those sort of nurturing and caring characteristics aren't always encouraged in boys, or aren't always seen as something that boys should or could indeed have. So I wanted to make sure that we started with the stereotypical boy. He's strong, he's brave and he's fearless, but he can care and look after others as well. After the boy fixes his rainbow, they go off on all the adventures together. They start to form a strong friendship and bond. So they sail the deepest oceans together, they climb the highest mountains, but unfortunately, and as what happens with rainbows, is it starts to get smaller and smaller until eventually the rainbow that he's cared for, that he loves, that he looked after, disappears altogether. And this is where we start to approach the subject of loss, of grief and of bereavement. This is where we start the journey with the boy through the stages of grief. There still seems to be some mixed research out there about how many stages of grief there are, but I decided to focus on 5. First of those being denial. So when he loses his rainbow and he starts to look around for it and he can't find it and he thinks it's gone, he feels confusion. A feeling of denial comes through in the questions he asks. Where had his rainbow gone? He was sure that his rainbow hadn't left him. all of that is part of the process of denial. That is the first stage of dealing with grief, and that is the first thing I wanted to highlight as he goes on this journey. The second stage is anger, and this is a great emotion that we need to recognise more, because quite often we ask children to suppress their anger, that they shouldn't feel angry, but actually feeling angry is normal. We all feel angry at some point, and it's absolutely natural to feel a bit of anger, even in bereavement, which can seem a bit strange and contrasting to feeling sad and the loss of somebody you love or something you love. But in this instance, anger is part of that journey. And the boy feels angry that his rainbow that he looked after, that he cared for, had gone. The next stage is bargaining. Again, you'll see the boy do this in the story. This is where he really talks up to the sky and is saying, please come back, don't leave me, I'll do anything. That's bargaining language. So I wanted again to highlight that's part of the stages of grief. That's something to be expected when you're grieving or if you suffer bereavement. And this is again just part of that process. The final two stages of grief are depression and acceptance. And for me, one of the biggest challenges as an illustrator was, how do I display and demonstrate depression in a children's picture book, because that isn't something that you would usually see. But I didn't want to shy away from it being raw and from it being emotional. So this is where the little boy hits rock bottom and he's devastated, because he now realises that his rainbow has gone and it is not coming back. But what I did do in this image and in this illustration is that we have his beloved dog down here at the bottom, who guides him through these feelings that he's currently having. And in this instance, he says, we all feel sad sometimes. And that's again a really important message for children to hear, because we quite often expect children to get on with it and to be okay, and the phrase man up is quite often used. And so I was looking to challenge that and to say, actually, we all feel sad sometimes for various reasons, and that's okay. Now, this is where the story returns to the familiar start, where we were talking about what does it mean to be strong and brave and fearless. And we started in the stereotypical way of climbing mountains and sailing oceans and fighting dragons. But now in this final stage of grief, we are looking at acceptance. And acceptance is really difficult because you've suffered loss, you're feeling sad, you're feeling hurt. But accepting and then being able to move on is all part of the process. Even though the boy felt sad, he was still strong and he was still brave and he was still fearless. And actually, as his dog tells him, it's okay to cry. And that message is really important, especially when it comes to dealing with bereavement. Because when you've lost someone you love or something you love and it's not coming back, that's sad, and that's okay to feel sad, and we don't have to suppress that emotion. We can cry about it in order to move on and to continue with our daily lives. So I wanted to make the point that this boy was still strong and he was still brave and he was still fearless, and it's okay to cry. That's absolutely fine. Now what I'm going to do is explain a bit about the end of the story. The boy still continues on his adventures. So he still sails those deep oceans, he still climbs the highest mountains, and he still fights those deadly dragons. So he is able to move on with his life. He has now travelled through the stages of grief and has come out the other end and is able to continue with his life. He always will have the memories of the time he spent together with his rainbow, and I wanted to bring that back to the forefront, but in a really positive way. So when the boy meets the deadliest dragon again, he spots that there's a rainbow that reappears in the sky. And that's the first time that he's really reminded about all the memories and all the adventures he had together with the rainbow. And at this point, this is where we really highlight the acceptance part, because on the last part of the story, he remembers and he smiles. And I just wanted him to have the memories and to have that moment with the dragon, and knowing that although he had lost the rainbow, although it wasn't coming back, they had still lots of great times together, there were lots of good memories, and that he was ready to move on with his life. And that is a bit of an insight into why I wrote the story, how I wrote the story, and some of the key elements that can be drawn from the story. When I was researching how to support children with bereavement, one of the main things was being able to talk to children about what had happened, how they were feeling, and what they were going through. And those sorts of conversations can be really, really difficult. So my hope was that this book would act as a discussion prompt, so you could read the story and it may or may not trigger some of those difficult questions that you've been looking to pose, or it may or may not encourage the child to start talking about how they're feeling, or about how they're feeling about the death of a loved one. There are lots of organisations and charities out there that will have done more research than I have about how you can support individual children when dealing with bereavement. And I would recommend you now go away and do more research yourself about the individual difficulties and challenges that you are maybe facing. I hope that my book can be of some help, and I also hope that giving you a bit of a background into why I wrote the story and some of the elements that I've included within the story itself may help you start to break down some of those barriers to having these good, meaningful discussions with children about death and about loss of somebody they love. If you require any further information, or if you would like to contact me about anything that we've discussed in this video today, feel free to drop me a message and I will try my best to get back to you. I hope you find this video helpful, and thanks again for supporting my work. Bye!